For Alaska, geography is both a blessing and a curse. Separated from the lower 48 by hundreds of miles of Canada, Alaska's connection to the rest of the U.S. is uniquely vulnerable. In early 2025, a sudden trade war between the U.S. and Canada put Alaska's economy in jeopardy. The highways that bring in food, fuel, and tourists are now at the center of an international standoff. What started as broad tariffs quickly escalated, threatening Alaska's lifeline to the rest of the country. For Alaskans, this isn't just about policy, it's about daily survival. This video explores how the 2025 US-Canada trade war hit Alaska hardest. From tariffs and tolls to jobs and political fallout, we'll break down the numbers, the politics, and the global stakes. At its core, this is a story about how one state became the front line in a new era of economic conflict. On March 3, 2025, the Trump administration shocked North America with sweeping tariffs. These tariffs were not just minor adjustments but significant economic measures that would ripple through various sectors. A 25% tariff hit most Canadian and Mexican imports, with a targeted 10% on Canadian energy. This move was seen as a direct challenge to the economic stability of the neighboring countries. The stated reason: fighting fentanyl trafficking. The administration claimed that these tariffs would help curb the flow of illegal drugs into the United States. But data showed U.S. fentanyl deaths were already dropping, and Canadian border seizures were nearly zero. Critics argued that the tariffs were more about economic leverage than drug control. By April, tariffs intensified, reaching the highest U.S. rates since 1901, including a 145% tariff on Chinese goods. This escalation was unprecedented and sent shockwaves through global trade networks. The administration also announced a 25% tariff on all imported vehicles and auto parts, threatening North America's auto industry. Automakers were left scrambling to adjust their supply chains. Global markets reacted instantly. Japan's Nikkei and Hong Kong's Hang Seng both dropped as uncertainty spread. Investors were wary of the long-term impacts on international trade. The message to Canada was clear: no special treatment, only economic hardball. The relationship between the two countries grew increasingly strained. The result? A rapid escalation, with Canada certain to retaliate. Canadian officials began preparing countermeasures to protect their economy. For Alaska, the consequences of these policies would soon become painfully real. The state's economy, heavily reliant on cross-border trade, faced significant disruptions. The stage was set for a trade war with no easy off-ramp. Both nations braced for a prolonged economic conflict that would test their resilience and diplomatic skills. Canada wasted no time responding. Within hours of the U.S. announcement, the Canadian government convened emergency meetings in Ottawa, determined to show both resolve and unity. The mood was tense, but there was no hesitation. Canada would not back down in the face of economic aggression from its closest neighbor. Prime Minister Trudeau's government hit back with 25% tariffs on $20 billion in U.S. goods, targeting autos, steel, and politically sensitive industries. These tariffs were carefully chosen to inflict maximum pain on key American sectors, especially those in swing states and regions vital to U.S. manufacturing. The message was unmistakable. Canada would defend its interests, and it knew exactly where to strike. But Canada didn't stop at tariffs. Ottawa threatened non-tariff barriers, regulatory delays, customs slowdowns, and more. These measures could snarl cross-border trade, disrupt supply chains, and create uncertainty for businesses on both sides of the border. The threat alone sent shockwaves through North American markets as companies scrambled to assess the potential fallout. The most dramatic move came from British Columbia, a bill to impose tolls on all traffic using its highways to reach Alaska. This proposal was unprecedented, signaling a willingness to use geography as leverage in the escalating dispute. The idea quickly gained traction in the provincial legislature, with lawmakers arguing it was a necessary response to U.S. provocation. The Alaska Highway, a vital artery for supplies and tourism, was now a bargaining chip. For decades, it had symbolized cooperation and connection between the two countries. Now, it was at the center of a high-stakes standoff, with the livelihoods of thousands hanging in the balance. For Alaska, this was an existential threat. No other state faced such a direct squeeze. The state's unique geography meant that any disruption to the highway could isolate communities, cut off essential goods, and devastate local economies. Alaskans watched anxiously as the situation unfolded, aware that their fate was now tied to international brinkmanship. Canada's strategy was clear: make the trade war as painful as possible for the US by targeting Alaska's unique vulnerability. By focusing on a region with little political clout in Washington but enormous logistical importance, Ottawa hoped to force a rethink in the White House. Ottawa gambled that pressure from Alaska would force Washington to reconsider. The hope was that Alaskan leaders, business owners and ordinary citizens would demand action from Congress and the President, turning a regional crisis into a national political headache. The message was unmistakable: disrupt North American trade, and Canada will use every tool at its disposal, including Alaska's isolation, to defend its interests. The stakes had never been higher. The trade war had just gotten personal for the last frontier. For Alaskans, the conflict was no longer an abstract policy debate. It was a real and immediate threat to their way of life, and the world was watching to see what would happen next. The threat of Canadian tolls on the Alaska Highway struck at Alaska's core. This road is the state's main land link for groceries, fuel, and medical supplies. Tolls would drive up costs for every Alaskan, from families to small businesses. Tourism, vital to the state, would suffer as RVs and road trippers reconsidered the journey. The economic partnership with Canada, worth over $1.3 billion in annual trade, was suddenly at risk. Indigenous communities with cross-border ties faced new barriers to family and tradition. Alaska's geography, once a symbol of adventure, was now a choke point. The trade war threatened to isolate Alaska economically, socially, and culturally. The numbers are stark. Alaska exports nearly $600 million worth of goods to Canada every year, ranging from seafood and minerals to machinery and energy products. This trade is not just a statistic, it's a lifeline for communities across the state, connecting Alaskan producers to international markets and supporting local livelihoods. In return, Alaska imports over $750 million in Canadian goods annually, including essential supplies, equipment, and consumer products that keep businesses running and store shelves stocked, especially in remote areas where options are limited. Altogether, 20,300 Alaskan jobs depend directly on this cross-border relationship. Real people working in logistics, retail, natural resources, and tourism. These are the faces behind the numbers, families whose livelihoods are tied to the ebb and flow of trade. But now, tariffs threaten to add hundreds of millions in extra costs to this vital exchange, squeezing businesses and families alike. For many, these added expenses could mean the difference between staying afloat and shutting down. Alaska's economy is highly concentrated. Over 75% of its exports come from just 5 industries: seafood, minerals, oil and gas, forestry, and tourism. This lack of diversification makes the state especially vulnerable to sudden shocks. If Canada targets key sectors like seafood or minerals with retaliatory tariffs, the damage could be devastating, rippling through entire communities and threatening the stability of the state's economic foundation. The aggressive U.S. tariff policy has pushed the national average rate to 28%, a level not seen in decades, and has invited global retaliation from trading partners around the world. Projections warn that millions of U.S. jobs could be at risk if the trade war escalates, with Alaska among the most exposed due to its reliance on a handful of export industries and its geographic isolation. The state's lack of economic diversity leaves few options to absorb the shock, making it difficult for workers and businesses to pivot or recover quickly. For Alaska, the trade war isn't just a headline, it's a looming economic crisis that threatens the very fabric of its communities and the future of the last frontier. The pain here is a warning for the rest of the country. When trade falters, it's not just numbers on a balance sheet, it's real people, real jobs, and real communities at risk. Alaska's leaders responded with rare unity. In March 2025, the State House passed a bipartisan resolution urging both Washington and Ottawa to de-escalate. The message: Alaska's unique geography demands special consideration. Tolls and trade barriers threaten its very survival. Lawmakers highlighted deep ties with Canada, shared history, cross-border indigenous communities, and joint resource management. The resolution was more than symbolic. It was a plea to protect a partnership built over generations. While D.C. pushed confrontation, Alaska called for diplomacy and mutual respect. For the state, Canada isn't a rival, it's a neighbor and essential partner. Alaska's political voice stood in sharp contrast to the national rhetoric. The US-Canada trade war quickly went global. China retaliated with 125% tariffs on US goods and halted Boeing imports, while restricting exports of rare earth minerals vital to American industry. The message: China would match US escalation and disrupt critical supply chains. The European Union prepared $23 billion in retaliatory tariffs, pausing implementation for 90 days to allow for negotiation. The world was fracturing into economic blocks, with global supply chains in flux. For Alaska and the US, this meant not just lost markets in Canada, but mounting instability worldwide. The Trump administration's unilateral approach was isolating America from allies and competitors alike. Businesses faced higher costs, lost access, and deep uncertainty. The trade war's ripple effects threatened to reshape global commerce. Alaska's crisis was now part of a much larger storm. Behind the numbers are real Alaskans, truckers, small business owners, and seafood processors, whose livelihoods are on the line. The threat of tolls and tariffs could mean bankruptcy for family businesses and lost jobs for thousands. Uncertainty has frozen investment and hiring, stifling growth and innovation. For a state already facing high costs, every new barrier squeezes household budgets further. The trade war acts as a hidden tax, raising prices at the grocery store, gas pump, and beyond. For many, the conflict is a daily source of anxiety and diminished opportunity. Alaska's people are paying the price for a fight they didn't start. The 2025 trade war has exposed Alaska's deep dependence on Canada and the fragility of North American ties. What began as a tariff dispute is now a direct threat to Alaska's economy, jobs, and way of life. The state's leaders have called for reason, but global tensions continue to rise. The fallout is a stark reminder. Trade policy has real-world consequences for families and communities. Alaska's crisis is a test of the US-Canada partnership and the resilience of global trade. As of September 2025, the conflict remains unresolved, with only a slim window for negotiation. The path forward is uncertain. Will diplomacy prevail, or is this the start of a new era of economic rivalry? For Alaska, the answer will decide its future at the crossroads of geography and geopolitics.